Islands are very interesting places for scientists and biologists to study because of the unique situation of high levels of speciation that often occur on islands. So we'll talk a little bit here about the Galapagos Islands off of Ecuador and the Hawaiian Islands, which were formed by volcanic activity. So they are actually volcanic islands, and when they were first formed, because of the lava flow forming the land masses, they were initially lifeless. Then through colonization processes, first of bacteria, and then, or the important bacteria were the ones that could photosynthesize, and they can arrive via ocean currents or the wind, and some bacteria can establish a foothold on lifeless land, especially, again, the ones that can photosynthesize. And in new environments, populations that arrive on a new territory, like an island, they can start to diverge and form new species relatively quickly because of the new habitats and the new environments that are they encounter on islands. So once bacteria are able to colonize a place, other early colonizing species can arrive, like lichens, which can actually live on bare volcanic rock and start to break it down. And the initial colonization process is fairly slow. But once you have lichens and bacteria living there, and once they die and start to decompose, gradually you get a buildup of organic material, and that can develop little bits of soil. And then windblown seeds can land, and then you can get the development of grasses and things like mosses, small, simple plants. And once they start growing, and then again they'll die, decompose, and you get the formation of soil that gets accelerated soil formation. And once you get more soil, then you get larger plants that start to arrive and develop. And then once you get a fair amount of plant material, then insects and birds can start to show up, and then things accelerate and accelerate. So on initially bare, lifeless islands, you can get places that have a fair amount of plant and animal biodiversity, like on the Galapagos and the Hawaiian Islands. And if you've ever been to the Hawaiian Islands, some of the parts of the islands are very lush and rich with vegetation and plant life and animal life. So in the Galapagos Islands, one of the world's greatest showcases of speciation, and we've talked about Darwin's finches already. One species of finch arrived, right, a founding colony of finches, and today there are 14 different species. They're all they are finch species, so they have finch traits of finch birds, but they differ in their feeding habitats, resources they utilize. And birds handle their environment and obtain food with their beaks or their bills. So the original population started to fragment into separate, isolated populations based on the food resources they started to utilize. And once that happens, reproduction between those isolated groups or populations starts to become less and less. You get reproductive isolation. As soon as you get reproductive isolation, each isolated population starts down its own evolutionary path. Eventually, with enough time, they will start to differ genetically, meaning enough microevolutionary change builds up in their genetic material, such that the birds start to look different, right? Phenotypically, because genotypically they are different. And when enough differences build up within their genomes, and their phenomes, their physical characteristics, they at some point will no longer interbreed, and boom, we say a speciation, a macro evolutionary event has occurred. And that's occurred numerous times with the original founding population of finches on the Galapagos Islands. And just to refresh or revisit this little bit, where we talked about certain species that have separated populations that are currently diverging such the point where they will become eventually separate species. And the reason they're reproductively isolated now is because they utilize different feeding resources, food resources, and or habitats, or they're breeding at different times, this temporal isolation business, or they breed in different habitats, habitat isolation. So these groups of separate populations of a single species are diverging genetically bit by bit. The differences accumulate within the isolated groups because of minimal reproduction. There's reproductive isolation. Eventually, they're most likely going to become separate species that will not be able to reproduce even if they are in the same habitat. In other words, even if the habitat isolation is removed, like the two separate groups start to utilize the same habitat, they would no longer reproduce because enough genetic differences have built up between the isolated groups. So again, macroevolution is a speciation event. It's an evolutionary change above the species level. In other words, two isolated groups of initially the same species diverge enough genetically, microevolutionary change, such that they cannot successfully interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring. They have become separate species. Macroevolution has occurred, or speciation has occurred. So understanding macroevolution by looking at a span of geologic time over which life's diversity has evolved. So by looking at the geologic record and the fossils and such, we can understand, given enough time with the Earth's history, that enough genetic differences can build up in the different isolated groups of a species, such that macroevolution, speciation, has occurred many, many, many times over Earth's history, and that has led to the incredible diversity we see today and the diversity that's existed in the past. So our fossil record, again, we've talked about this, a sequence in which fossils appear in rock strata that has developed over millennia, thousands and millions of years, even billions of years. And that's a snapshot, an archive of macroevolution, speciation events that have occurred over geologic time. So the geologic timescale divides Earth's history, formation of the Earth about 4.6 billion years ago, into a sequence of geologic periods. So here's the one from your textbook, 14.1, table 14.1. We are currently in the Cenozoic Cenozoic era. Previous to that, the Mesozoic area, and that boundary is 65 million years ago. Prior to that, the Paleozoic era, and that boundary was 250 million years ago. And before that, the Precambrian era, and that boundary was 542 million years ago. And then notice the scale. The Precambrian area is the longest era, Precambrian era. It spans billions of years. And then the earlier eras are broken up into periods: Quaternary, Tertiary, Cretaceous, Jurassic. You've heard of Jurassic Park, right? Triassic, etc. The only ones I really need you to know are Cenozoic era, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and then Precambrian era in terms of by name. And then we'll talk about this boundary here at the 65 million year boundary, which is a pretty significant one because that's when all the large dinosaurs went out. In other words, became extinct. But these boundaries between the eras and sometimes between the periods are there because there was major climatic events that led to massive extinction. And we'll talk about that. So, geologic record. Let's look at this little video here. Get that volume up for you guys. Here we go.
By studying various fossil records, geologists have put together a geologic record. Evidence in the fossil record of large-scale extinctions and/or enormous radiation of many diverse new life forms defines the main boundaries within the geologic record. As you move through the geologic record, the names and dates will change. Also, a diagram at the upper left will show what is known of the history of continental drift, based on evidence dating from the Mesozoic era. During the Precambrian time, which began at least 4,600 million years ago and ended 542 million years ago, life began on Earth. The first prokaryotic cells and cyanobacteria appeared, as well as the first animals. The beginning of the Paleozoic era, 542 million years ago, marked the origin of most modern animal phyla. The first plants, jawless fish, bony fish, and amphibians evolved. Amphibians became the dominant vertebrate life form, while the first reptiles and seed plants appeared. By the end of the era, 251 million years ago, many marine and terrestrial organisms had become extinct. The Mesozoic era stretched from 251 million to 65 million years ago. At the beginning of this era, the reptiles radiated out as dinosaurs to dominate the landscape, along with the cone-bearing plants, or gymnosperms. At the same time, the first birds and mammals originated. As the climate and Earth's surface changed, flowering plants appeared and many organisms, including most dinosaurs, became extinct.
The Cenozoic era followed the Mesozoic, 65 million years ago, and continues through modern times. The beginning of the era saw the radiation of the mammals, birds, and pollinating insects such as bees and butterflies. The angiosperms evolved to dominate the landscape as most modern mammalian orders appeared. The primate groups evolved, leading to the origin of ape-like human ancestors, and finally humans.
Okay. And if you watch this again, you'll see the movement of the continents over the surface of the Earth due to plate tectonics, which we'll also talk about here in a bit. Let's see if there's enough time for this video in this section. We've got, yeah, just enough time. Okay. Macroevolution, meaning speciation.
Microevolution by itself does not explain the diversity of life on Earth today. Let's investigate the role that macroevolution plays in this process. Multiplication of species creates biological diversity with the evolution of many different species from one common ancestor. This can be seen with Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. Sometimes referred to as branching evolution, or adaptive radiation, this occurs when multiple habitats and niches open up with relatively little competition. Evolutionary novelty results from the gradual refinement of existing structures for new functions. Here we see how ancestral birds may have used wing-like forelimbs for courtship. They could also have taken advantage of these enlarged forelimbs to allow for extended hops and gliding ability. Once flight itself became an advantage, natural selection would have remodeled feathers and wings to better fit their additional function. Explosive diversification often occurs following the evolution of an important adaptation. For instance, the evolution of the flower from early seed plants that were similar to modern conifers allowed plants to reproduce more efficiently and thus exploit many previously unavailable habitats and niches. After a mass extinction, previously filled niches and habitats are opened up. When the dinosaurs became extinct, mammals had the opportunity to evolve into those niches and produce incredible diversification.
Okay, so geologists learn the ages of rocks and fossils they contain by a process of radiometric dating. So it's a method based on the decay of radioactive isotopes, which are atoms that have an unstable nucleus, basically, and they break down at a consistent rate. So that gives you what's referred to sometimes as a geologic clock. So another method called relative dating is to date layers of volcanic ash or rock above and below sedimentary layers that would contain fossils, and that gives you the age of a particular layer. If you know the age above and below, well, this layer that's in between has to be between those two dates.